Brian Lehrer on WNYC. So now that it's squarely summer vacation, let's talk about school. No, I mean it. For decades, New York City parents and teachers have fought for smaller class sizes, right? And you know this law, in 2022, Albany finally gave them a law requiring it. No more than 20 to 25 kids per class, depending on the grade, phased in over several years. Public hearings are coming this summer, and compliance deadlines for the 20 to 25 are approaching this fall. But the law is landing at the exact moment that the city school system is shrinking, down roughly 160,000 students since 2020, according to our colleagues reporting at Gothamist. There's still about 900,000 students in the system, but the city now faces a puzzle. How do you make classes smaller in a system that's losing kids? And what do you sacrifice when you have to create more classrooms, hire more teachers? Is there anything that actually gets lost in that equation? Mayor Zohran Mamdani's answer, laid out in a plan released last month, is to spend big. He would spend $244 million this year to hire thousands of teachers and $1.5 billion in capital funds to build new classroom space at hundreds of schools. But that has touched off a real fight, and you can see it playing out in one school in particular in Washington Heights as a microcosm that our education reporter Jessica Gould did a story on. It's P.S. 187, where the city wants to build an addition on top of the schoolyard. Now, parents who spent years asking for smaller classes are now divided, Jessica reports, because the price is their kids' outdoor play space and years of construction going on while they're in their classes. Meanwhile, some advocates and budget watchdogs are asking a different pointed question: why build it all when there are half-empty schools just down the hill? So here to walk us through this complicated set of issues is Jessica Gould, education reporter for WNYC and Gothamist. Hey, Jess, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Brian.
So you've been following New York's class size law closely, I know. For listeners just catching up, what does this 2022 law actually require, and why is it suddenly forcing hard choices in the schools right now?
Yeah, we keep calling it the new class size law, and it's becoming increasingly far away that it was passed in 2022. But the truth is that they're still phasing it in. So part of the law was to reduce classes by to make them 20 to 25 students, depending on grade. And that's in comparison to the reality now at many schools, which is that there can be as many as in the low 30s in terms of numbers of students in classes. And it was phased in so that the city would have to meet that target, to have more and more schools at 20 to 25, depending on grade, over 5 years. And it actually was just extended because now we're at the rubber hits the road moment. The easy shifts have been made. The art rooms that could be turned into classrooms and, force the art teacher to deliver art programming classroom to classroom. They call it art on a cart. Schools have found the space largely that they can to make this work. And now it's the tougher question.
And you recently reported, as I said in the intro, on PSIS 187 in Washington Heights in particular. Paint that picture for us.
Sure. So this is a popular school that draws mostly from the neighborhood zone, though there are some families who enroll their kids from outside the zone. And it's an elementary and middle school together. It's increasingly popular to have these schools linked so that there's more continuity. It's in a more gentrified part of the neighborhood. And it's a popular school. Parents want to send their kids there, and they have been bursting at the seams for years. They're 25% over capacity. They did get rid of the art room, and the art teacher is now doing art on a cart. And they've made some steps toward achieving the goal of the class size law, particularly in, I think it was the first grade that was really overpopulated and overcrowded, but they still have a long way to go. And so, it's been years now of discussions between members of the community and the school system trying to figure out how to make this work. They looked at everything from staggering schedules, so starting school later for some grades, to outdoor classrooms, which didn't end up happening, to now building a new building on part of the large blacktop that they have there for school recess.
Are you finding parents at PSIS 187 in Washington Heights who are like, come on, Albany, give us smaller class sizes, require smaller class sizes. This is the best thing that's going to help all our kids learn and flourish. And now that it's coming down to what the trade-offs will be, they're suddenly changing their mind?
Well, I know that there are people who have been really excited about smaller classes. They've been advocating for it. Some of the chief advocates of the law have been parents at the school. And, as we've talked about before, there's research that shows that smaller classes have benefits. It's been a top priority for many parents, for many teachers. But yes, there are a lot of parents who are saying now that it's going to happen, there's going to be construction in the coming years. They don't want to give up their large play space outside. It wouldn't be all of it. It's going to be a portion. But that's construction noise and dust, which is disruptive to the school, and it's disruptive to the neighbors who live nearby, some of whom send their kids to the school. This is the tension that is now bubbling over.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT, FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio and live streaming at WNYC.org, coming up on 11 o'clock with our education reporter, Jessica Gould, on the new tensions at some of the schools in New York City in particular, as they face the actual deadlines in implementing the class size law that many advocates had fought for and got passed by Albany as these deadlines approach, to reduce class sizes to no more than 20 to 25 kids per class, depending on grade, and on this phase-in schedule over a series of years. There do seem to be two very different roads to smaller classes. One option is to build new space, like you were just describing at PSIS 187. The other is to move students between schools. So can you walk us through what that option would entail and some of the trade-offs with that, and maybe you have an example of that from somewhere in the city?
Sure. I mean, I think the advocates for the class size law and the people who've been studying this would say that you're going to need both. You're going to need to have some construction, and you're going to have to shift enrollment, especially, as you mentioned, because the enrollment is declining across the school system. People have been leaving the schools for the suburbs, to some extent for private schools and charter schools, but largely because of affordability and mostly, I think, because of declining birth rates. It's an issue that's happening across the country in school districts. So, it's declining overall, but as you can see at PSIS 187, it's not declining evenly. It's declining in pockets, and then there are some schools that are overcrowded. So the question about enrollment is whether you cut off some access to some of these more popular schools. You shrink the number of kids who can enter, in pre-K kindergarten, so that there are fewer kids going to the schools. But the concern is that if you further limit access to these high-demand schools, then more families will opt out of the public school system, whether it be for charters. And in Washington Heights, there are a lot of charter schools popping up nearby, or, to go to the suburbs and move out of the city altogether. And that is the kind of balance that policymakers have been weighing for a long time. And all of the administrations, in recent years, the mayoral administrations have shied away from making major changes in enrollment and access. They say it's important for families to have choice over which schools they send their kids to. But you also see that a lot of this choice also correlates with, the demographics of a school, the socioeconomics of the families there. And so these become particularly charged questions about whether you're cutting off access to certain schools.
Listener texts, it might be relevant to mention that they're dealing with a completely different cohort of parents than were involved in the discussions prior to the law being passed 4 years ago. I guess that's true in some cases. I mean, some of the same kids could have been in the lower grades. They're still in the system now in the higher grades. But it is true that the parents entering the system, and I think you've been saying that the conflict is mostly in the lower grades. They're entering a world they didn't know they'd be entering, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true to some extent. I agree that, some of these parents have been here for more than 4 years, and some have been involved in the activism around this. But one thing that was pointed out to me is that the DOE and the city move really slowly. And so the families who were, in conversation about this addition at PSIS 187 aren't all the same families that are going to be affected. So there is truth to that. I mean, particularly because of the slow pace of this phase-in and of, making construction changes at schools.
And a listener writes this question, do these class size rules apply only to public schools? What about charter and private?
No, not to charter and private.
Even to charter schools, because they are public schools, right?
They are public schools, but they have independence.
So if they want to put 50 kids in a class and parents apply their kids to enroll in those charter schools, they can do that. This alternative of capping or shifting enrollment, it keeps coming up. I saw that Leonie Hameson, who's been the lead advocate for reducing class size Matters is her group, the New York City-based nonprofit that's been working on this for so long, says this would be quick and cost-free, shifting around. But in your article on Gothamist in June, you wrote that shifting or restricting enrollment at popular schools can be a third rail in public education politics. What makes it so explosive?
Well, first of all, it's always parents and kids have strong ties to their schools. So any changes to schools, it can be very explosive in communities. And cutting off access to high demand schools, you mentioned that, this is mostly happening at the elementary level. I think that's true, but it's worth noting that there have been exemptions for compliance for all of the specialized high schools, which are some of the most high demand schools in the public school system. So, it's such a third rail that nobody so far is touching the enrollment at those schools. And I think that, what we saw on the Upper West Side earlier this winter, spring, when the city was trying to manage the shift in enrollment, the class size law. There's a PS 9 on the Upper West Side, which is a very popular elementary school. It was co-located with a popular middle school called the Center School, and to make room for the class size compliance and just the overcrowding of PS 9 in general, they were going to move the Center School to another school that had more room. There was also, at the same time, an effort to close under-enrolled middle schools on the Upper West Side. All of this was happening at the same time. And there was such a backlash to those proposals. And in fact, then it exploded when there was a racist comment made on a hot mic during a Zoom meeting, where a parent said that the black students at one of the schools that was slated for closure, were too dumb to know that they were in a bad school.
Ouch.
Yeah. So there's the race dynamics also end up playing a role because a lot of the high demand schools happen to have a higher proportion of white students than their counterparts. That doesn't mean that they're like super white or even majority white, because there are so few white students comparatively who go to the public schools. But so they can be, in relative terms diverse, but they are whiter and they tend to have, higher earning PTAs who can support additional teachers and services at the schools. So all of these issues of equity and race and class often become mixed in to these questions of who gets to go to what school and cutting off access to certain schools.
In fact, you found a demographic pattern which may be surprising to some listeners on who tends to be in the overcrowded schools versus the under-enrolled ones, right?
Well, yes. I mean, and this is interesting because I think that a lot of the advocates for the class size law were advocating for benefiting students of color and students from lower income households. But the more compliant the schools with classes that are smaller already tend to be in the higher needs neighborhoods, the higher needs schools. So basically, lower income schools, poorer schools are more likely to be meeting the targets right now for lower class sizes. They are more likely to already have the lower class sizes. That doesn't mean that they have all of them. And I think the number was about 70% of the highest needs schools have met the target, but that still means that 30% of the classes are overcrowded. And then the more high demand schools tend to be the schools that have more affluent families attending them.
A couple of texts related to PSIS 187 in Washington Heights that you reported on as an example of all this. Listener writes, I am a teacher who works for the DOE, and I'm also a parent whose child went through the schools in District 6, where PS 187 is located. I have taught in schools with large class sizes, and I now teach in a school that is fully compliant with the class size reduction mandate. If parents had any idea how much better it is for their children to be in a small class, they would never protest building an addition onto their building. There is no comparison. But another one writes, I have worked in many schools in Manhattan over the years. One of the fears about reassigning schools for New York City kids is that it could put them in a very dangerous neighborhood for that particular child to be in, and or into a school with less experienced teachers. And that probably brings up some of the race and class kinds of tensions that you were referring to before. And there's one more. Listener writes, PSIS 187 parent here. A relatively pain-free solution here would be to move the middle school into one of the half-empty other schools in the neighborhood. So that's an interesting set. Jessica, anything you were thinking of listening to any of those texts?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about the teacher that I interviewed at PSIS 187, who is a first grade teacher whose class went from 32 students to 21 students in closer compliance with the law. And she said that when I was teaching 32 students, it was hard to make sure I was meeting all of their needs. And that now that they have gotten a smaller class, it's been a breath of fresh air. She can target her instruction more to students' needs, individually. There's more time for one-on-one or smaller groups. And she feels like she was able to build close relationships. I've heard this from other teachers, too, that it has been a huge improvement to their classroom experience, not just theirs as teachers, but to the students, to be in smaller classes. And when we were talking about, people leaving for private schools, one of the draws to private schools historically has been the smaller class size. So people hope that the lower class sizes will actually bring more families back to the school system.
Is there evidence based on the under-enrolled schools, which you said are basically in the lower income areas, where just through, the course of things as they've been, there have been the smaller number of kids? Is there evidence that indicates that the smaller class sizes do make a difference for those kids who this movement has actually been aimed for, but some of them have it anyway?
I don't think that there is research yet on the results of that, though I did talk to somebody who's doing that research. But I think, so I've just been able to talk to people anecdotally, teachers and parents, and they feel positively about it. But there are also parents who have kids in larger classes at higher demand schools who say that their kids are doing just fine in these larger classes.
And one more text listener writes, it's more than just class size. Children of similar learning abilities and pace of learning must be grouped in separate classes, as was the case when I was growing up in New York City. In this way, slower learners don't fall behind and fast learners are not held back and bored with learning. Does this class size debate intersect with the debate that text raises, which is the tracking debate?
Well, I think that tracking is not popular now for a variety of reasons, including research showing that having diversity of learners together can be beneficial. But I think that the idea is that if you have a smaller group of kids, you can work more individually. You can understand more what the individual learner needs and then target more towards them, whereas that can get lost in the literal noise of an overcrowded classroom.
So in a last minute, the law's leading champion, who we mentioned before, Leonie Haimson of Class Size Matters, calls the current city plan for implementing the class size law hugely disappointing and not a real plan at all. What's her critique of the Mamdani plan, and has he responded? And then we're out of time.
Well, I know that she believes that there needs to be some consideration for and shifting of enrollment, as we've been discussing this whole time, even though it's controversial. She also has talked about, with all the affordable housing that he wants to build, attention to, construction of schools around that new housing. But in general, I think she wants to hear more of a commitment and detailed plan.
WNYC and Gothamist education reporter Jessica Gould, thanks for being on it and sharing it with our listeners, Jess.
Thank you.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.
The United States is about to mark its 250th anniversary.
And so on the Global Story podcast from the BBC, we're telling surprising tales of American influence on the world stage and in ordinary people's lives all across the globe.
We have this ability to export our story, and a lot of people have bought it.
I feel like the American dream is alive but not well.
From the BBC, it's the United States at 250.
Listen wherever you get your podcasts or find us on YouTube.